As a member of the Australian delegation, it was Fred Whitlam's obligation to advance the ideas that the government was proposing. The ideas had started in the mind of H.V. Evatt, but the advocacy was put by Fred Whitlam. In 1948, he was also actively engaged in advising the Australian delegation at the Human Rights Committee on the draft of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which Eleanor Roosevelt had presented to that committee for consideration, ultimately by the General Assembly. And it's from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 that all other developments in the field of international human rights since that year have occurred throughout the world. For Fred Whitlam, Australia as a nation stood for what he called international cooperation through the United Nations. He hoped that Australia would take, quote, a growing share in the building of a new world. It was this hope of an ideological perspective and discourse that influenced the developing views of his son, Gough, and those views were very much in tune with the approach of Dr. H.V. Evatt as the Minister for External Affairs and Attorney General, who had been a past Justice of the High Court of Australia. As Prime Minister of Australia, Gough Whitlam was eventually empowered to act beyond the calling of his father, the traditional public servant, and act he did. In the context of the greater engagement with the world, and specifically international law, that occurred during the Whitlam government, Australians today should reflect upon and remember the influence of the father, Fred Whitlam. A comprehensive understanding of Whitlam's internationalist outlook wouldn't be complete without examining some of the criticisms that have been expressed regarding some of the policies supported by Whitlam. They help to give a multi-dimensional view of Whitlam's outlook and achievements, and I am sure that even as I am delivering this lecture, Gough Whitlam is examining this part of the lecture with special care. The most common criticism of the Whitlam government was that it tried to do too much too soon. Gough answered that in his John Curtin Memorial Lecture in 1985, quote, "The cry of too much too soon comes from those who want to be good, but not yet, much in the style of St. Augustine. Give me chastity and continency, but do not give it to me yet. The cry of too much too soon comes from those who have forgotten that the great Labour victory of 1974 was based on the success of a broad range of reforms which the party had introduced since 1972, just as the great Labour victory of 1972 was based on the success of the broad range of reforms which the party had promoted since 1967. The Australian nation, with its rather complacent, self-satisfied, still racist, generally sexist, and definitely homophobic society of 1972, needed a jolt, and that it certainly received from the Whitlam government with its social legislation and international embrace. There are, of course, those who never stop complaining. Doubtless some of the complaints and criticisms are warranted, as for example the appointment of Senator Vince Gare of the Democratic Labour Party in the Senate as ambassador to Ireland in March 1974, an act which, as it was to prove, was too clever for its own good, and it was destined to play a part in the series of steps that ultimately led to the dismissal of the government by Sir John Kerr. Another common criticism of the Whitlam government, in media and political circles in particular, is that it was distracted by Gough Whitlam's interests as a lawyer and social observer interested in human rights and internationalisation, as if he should not be interested in such subjects. Inattentive to economic management, he is said to have been, and it is clearly a central function of modern government, and therefore this is said to be a grievous fault. No doubt some aspects of the nation's economic management between 73 and 5 could be criticised, even allowing for international forces at work over which Whitlam and Australia had little control. Not least would this be so at the end of the government when it faced the crisis of the delay in the provision of supply by the Senate. But an interesting speech to this institute in November 2009, Dr. Ken Henry, the Secretary of the Treasury, made an important point concerning the role that was played by the Whitlam government in increasing outlays on the shape and size of national government in Australia to match those of comparable developed governments throughout the world. In Dr. Henry's opinion, as one of the most important and respected professional economists of Australia, this shift in funding was beneficial for the nation, and it contributed to its well-being and has proved enduring. When the drama and bitterness of 1975 are put to one side, a great legacy of institutions and laws was put in place in a remarkably short space of time. Any examination of the government's record, said Whitlam, clearly demonstrates that a great part of the work either survived intact or was sufficiently advanced. His signing of the ICCPR shortly after being appointed as Prime Minister in 1973 was neither largely dismantled nor nullified upon Whitlam's dismissal from office. On the contrary, after Whitlam signed the ICCPR, the Fraser government 8 years later ratified the two international conventions. Further, there was no vigorous effort by any Australian governments after the Whitlam administration to dismantle Australia's obligations under the many international instruments that Whitlam had ratified or signed and that I've outlined to you today. One blemish in the Whitlam record was probably the attitude to the Vietnamese refugees. Pretty clearly, the government was concerned that the refugees would have vehement anti-communist sympathies antagonistic to the Australian Labor Party. On this basis, several critics of Whitlam's policy and members of the Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs of the Senate have argued that Whitlam did everything possible to prevent Vietnamese asylum seekers from reaching Australia and without a properly justifiable basis. An arguable explanation for that policy with respect to the South Vietnamese refugees is found in Australian departmental files for 1975, which have now become accessible. In effect, these reveal Whitlam's opposition to accepting asylum seekers from Vietnam as being based on a national policy not to further upset the communist regime in Hanoi. But in retrospect, it was an uncompassionate stance. Similar concerns appear to have influenced the Whitlam government's response to the early demands by the people of East Timor for self-determination and the importance attached in that respect to relations between Australia and Indonesia at the time. Now, no political leader in history has ever been flawless. Whitlam is a proud man, and to adapt Churchill's description of Attlee, he has much to be proud about. The events of late 1975 in East Timor were unfolding just as in Australia the Whitlam government was facing daily crises and eventually the blow that finished it. Concern about the viability of a new and very small state on Australia's borders was arguably legitimate at that time. Yet, as events have shown, it was erroneous. Anxiety to have good relations with Indonesia was, it's true, a legitimate policy. But the stance on East Timor was the more surprising because of the consistent support which Gough Whitlam always gave over many decades to the principle of the people's right to self-determination, which is enshrined in the two common first articles to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the International Covenant on Economic ICCPR. Various influences took Whitlam in the direction of this international approach that I've described. The first, as I've explained, were the values that he derived from his father. Another, common at the time with many Australians, was his military service. For Whitlam, war service undoubtedly fuelled his appreciation of international affairs. More importantly, it helped him to understand the significance of a sustained effort by humanity to remedy the fundamental global problems. He cites his period in the armed forces as critical for the development of his ideas regarding citizenship, colonialism, constitutionalism. Quote, "My time in the RAAF gave me time to formulate my religious and political ideas, or at least my ecclesiastical and constitutional ones." Now, whilst most service personnel of that era might have described the impact of their engagement at a somewhat lower level in the social stratosphere, many who served returned to civilian life with a similar determination to work towards building a safer world free from war and more concerned about the rights of ordinary people.